Thanks to our Patreon members for helping to make this episode possible, and we're now available on all the major podcasting platforms. You can find more information at the links below. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Part 9 and the conclusion of House of the Intellect. So I want to roll all the way back around and get back to the personal. So we started small and narrow and personal with the core values and the importance of believing in what you're interested in, regardless of whatever the social environment is that tells you about this, and engaging with certain manners of thought and behavior that will feed back into that. Then we looked at some of the social processes and pressures that we face that mitigate against our attempts to recreate an environment in which we can benefit from and feel involved in the House of the Intellect. And now I want to bring that back down to the personal again, because this is where we're going to circle back to, because functionally what Barzon is after in the House of the Intellect, and what I think we're after communally, is the notion of a humanism. So what this means is whatever other values people might pursue, and there's lots of possible values, what the House of the Intellect really says is, hey, humans, human ideas, human capacity, human creativity is super valuable. It's kind of a, philosophically speaking, of course, this is how I tend to look at things, you can look at it as an extension of or a growth out of a concept of an idea of what humans are and of humanism. And so when you think about things like bureaucracy and technology, larger social structures, often, they do all kinds of things. They make money, they make quote unquote progress, they organize systems, whatever they do, those are all great. Those are all good goals. But the goal of humanism is sort of healthy, happy humans, which is not what many of these other institutions or structures that we're faced with and dealing with are striving for. And so when we focus in our own lives and in our own communities, we're thinking of these moments in terms of a kind of humanism that will hopefully help us thrive. And one of the big problems that we face there, that on both a structural and a personal level, is that we have bad narratives. And what's amazing here is how we got them. And so let me give you an example. When I first went to college many years ago, I thought, wow, I want to go into the arts, originally music, and then art history, and then eventually I ended up in English and philosophy. But what I had in mind was, participating in the great salons with great ideas and all this. And what I soon discovered is this trick that's been played on us culturally. And what I noticed looking around is like, hey, those people in the sciences do almost everything in groups, right? Their science is a group endeavor. They're over there, they're working in teams, they have group projects, they're on research grants as groups, they have research institutions, they do all these things as groups. And over here in the humanities, theoretically, we have all these projects that we're working on. Like you write a paper by yourself. There's limited opportunity to do group projects. There's a great focus on the individual output. And I thought, okay, that's okay. The novelist, the painter, these are individual things. This is kind of what we're mirroring, this idea. And after a while, I kind of realized like, oh, they're tricking us. They've created a trick. And what this trick is that I think we've fallen for culturally in a big way is like what I call sort of shorthand, the creative genius narrative. And our creative genius narrative is that the isolated individual produces great works of art that transcend society and create human progress and reshape culture and come down to us as the jewels of human civilization that we can then participate in, reflect on, and inspires the next generation of great geniuses. Now, it's not that this is all wrong. There's, incredibly powerful individuals have created all kinds of great and wonderful things that we get to inherit. And I think that's one of the wonderful things about exploring history in the world of ideas and art and architecture and music is like, wow, all these hundreds or thousands of years of human capacity being expressed and handed down. I mean, what a great treasure trove, what inheritors of untold wealth we are so fortunate to be. But the narrative that's behind this, I think, is grossly misleading and actually poisonous. So what we're faced with is we're always told it is the isolated genius. This is what we see in movies. This is what we see in stories. This is the narrative that we're presented with, and this is the models that's reproduced in schools. But by the way, this is historically anomalous, which I'll talk to you about in a second. But think of all the great models that we're given. It's not accidental that the two models that we get most often for artistic creation in movies is generally, for at least for a long time, and in novels, is the writer and the painter, right? These are two people that theoretically work alone and express their vision alone, right? It is the output of their mind, a Picasso or a Hemingway or Dostoevsky. These processes. It's the individual genius working alone. And even when that is not the case, when you get something like a Mozart or a Beethoven or something, the biographies and the movies tend to focus, again, on the isolated individual genius. And what's crazy about this is there's just almost no evidence that artists, writers, creators, scientists, even the ones that are presented as the models, worked this way. This is just not the history of creative and intellectual, scientific, mathematical production. I mean, there are exceptions, of course, because humans occur on the bell curve. But if you take someone like, say, Mozart spent, his life writing music for, working with, interacting with courts, hugely complex, social systems, symphonic and orchestral groups, and, opera. The opera at the time was about the most complicated thing short of a war you could do. It involved training singers and training musicians and getting print and costuming. And it was all the arts, right? That's the magic of opera. It's sort of all the arts at once live in front of you. And Mozart was responsible for working on all of that. So, and he just seemed to live his life basically going from one party to another party to another party. And people go, you go, oh, well, at some point he must have sat quietly writing. And it turns out that the historical record suggests that he did. Of course, he had to at some point, but not a lot. He wrote a bunch of his music while in carriages because he traveled around, loved to travel, and he seemed to apparently spurred his mind. And so he would be in carriages with people traveling, writing music, which is just extraordinary to think about. So, or a writer like Dostoevsky. Dostoevsky lived in a crowd. Oh my gosh. He continually complained about not having quiet time to write while doing everything in his power to not have quiet time to write. And yet he somehow wrote a significant amount. Let us say, and he, and that's just counting his fiction work with which people are more familiar. He wrote a lot of nonfiction, a lot of like newspapery, editorially type stuff, which was influential and well noted at the time. So he was a prolific writer who lived in piles. He lived with people coming and going almost continuously. And so again, it's not that he didn't have some quiet time where he did sit and write, but this is that idea that, it's the isolated genius who's not working with other people, who doesn't have any interaction with them, who really sets the standard. And of course, the sort of apotheosis of this is the Ayn Rand's vision of the genius as the person who has to be misunderstood by society, that society actively attacks the individual, the society actively undermines their capacities and rejects them, and that if you're a genius, you're going to be rubbished by society and this kind of thing. It's kind of crazy, nonsensical stuff. But this was the idea. If anything, it's the other way around that's true, is that this narrative of individuality undercuts our capacity for creativity and productivity and for joy. Those are this is the big problem. And I go back to the Renaissance model, and you think about, people pick, like Michelangelo, pick the greats, and you go, wow, how did they do so much? And Michelangelo did architecture, sculpture, poetry, you name it, painting, of course. You did one or two paintings. You go, wow, how did somebody do this? But the idea in the Renaissance was basically if you have an interesting, powerful, fascinating individual, it doesn't matter what they do, it'll be interesting, powerful, and fascinating, right? And that the way you become interesting, powerful, and fascinating is by being with people, reflecting, being in conversation, working in groups, right? All these artists, and in now art history, they're all saying, of course, look, these artists were working with teams. They were working in shops. They were closer to the factory that model that you get, rather than the isolated genius working in a studio on their own. I mean, you had some artists, had some assistants doing parts and sketching, and the concepts were coming from the funders, and so on and so forth. So this notion that you can only produce genius in isolation and in contrast and conflict with your society is utter nonsense. Mendelssohn, hello. And yet that's obviously, it's so obviously that this is the narrative. But why does this matter? It matters because that impulse then says, hey, like I said when I went to college and realized, like, oh, you want me to sit alone at my desk and pretend like I'm an island, as opposed to saying, hey, let's get together as a group and come up with something great. And again, the models that we take are not group models, right? Again, symphony orchestras, opera, painting schools, architectural projects that take lots of people. These sorts of models are rarely given as the cultural norm for artistic and intellectual production, even though they are by far the historical norm. I mean, this is the norm. This is where all this stuff comes from, that we're the great inheritors of. But instead, we get this false myth of the, Einstein and his annus mirabilis, where he's working at the patent office and sitting in an attic and just coming up with all these ideas on his own. When in fact, Einstein did have an annus. If anybody ever had a miracle year, it was Einstein. The papers that he produced one after another in very short order, it just doesn't make sense. It's otherworldly, but he was not working on his own. He was talking with people, meeting with people, continually writing letters. He was reading the latest journals. He was doing all kinds of work related to and talking to people about what he was interested in, what he was trying to do. And as I've said before, the general theory of relativity as opposed to the special theory of relativity, he worked very closely with lots of people, including Hilbert, because the math was so hard. He said, I want to work together with another mathematician and make a go of it. So that model that is given to us, again, of the isolated genius is both nonsensical and counterproductive. And so I'd ask people to say, hey, change your thought process a little bit. If you've fallen into this trap, the notion is not just that I'm isolated, but that I should be isolated and that it's a good thing. Even if it makes me uncomfortable, well, this is the kind of isolation that genius needs, or if too many people are around me, or if I'm compromising, or any of that kind of stuff is just ridiculous, right? Like all those thoughts are what's given to us. It's not that those aren't fair questions, hello Rousseau, but they are questions that our society has already answered for us. So if you're asking the question, hey, what's the trade-off? Where is too much? That's a great question. However, if we're just responding to and going, oh, well, this is a society trying to shape me or limit my vision or compromise my ideals, it's like, probably that knee-jerk reaction could be very, very misleading. And as an example, I would say, when thinking about this, imagine that your model is not the painter or the writer. It is a band, like I say, let's just say a rock band. Right? So if your model is a rock band and you think, wow, I want to do rock music, like this is your goal, like this is the art form that I love rock music, I want to be in a rock band, this is a totally great, natural, wonderful idea, let's all be in rock bands. Well, see, you already think, well, I need some more people, right? Let's get some more people. I want some people. And that just functional vision of going, oh, let's get together with some friends and make something happen. That impulse is much more more historically normative than the isolated genius doing whatever. It has been this process of, hey, let's get some people together and do something cool. And part of this narrative that's come down to us, I think of as the Oscar speech, not the filmmaking. And so when I talk to people about painting and writing and filmmaking and all these other processes, the emphasis is often like, what does success look like? Success looks like a best-selling novel, or success looks like giving an Oscar speech, which is why I have this as my shortened in my mind. However, the success of filmmaking is making a film. That's the success. The process of making the outcome. See, what has happened is we've embraced the outcome so much, and we're so product oriented, output oriented, and we have that mindset so powerfully driven into us that it's like, I've got to produce something good. I've got to produce something successful. I have to produce something that makes everybody look at me and go, wow. And so that emphasis on output rather than going, look, if I get together with some friends and we do something fun, make something cool, and then we finish and we go, wow, that didn't work very well. Let's do it again, right? Which is pretty much the history of the production of art, I would say. Every once in a while something great comes out, but often, not so much. Picasso said this, by the way. Somebody commented on one of his paintings, and he looked at him and he said, hey, does everything I paint have to be masterwork? No, it doesn't, right? Like it's okay for him to just knock some crap out, which he did. And he was ready to admit that because he was always trying new stuff, right? Everything doesn't have to be a masterpiece because he just liked painting, right? And if you like painting, you can paint. If you like making music with your friends, you can make music with your friends. If you like making movies, you can make movies with your friends, right? Like it's all very doable if that narrative switches around, because to be the recognized genius, to be the man apart of the society, you need that social either support and endorsement, which is, now we recognize you as genius, or you need that social pushback and, you're being cut out, which is, again, you need that response. You need that outside force actually validating what you're doing, telling you you're great or awful or whichever way it goes. So another way of looking at it is to go, like if you're together with your band, we'll just stick with the rock and roll model, which is, from history, pretty well established, right? You're drinking beer and you're smoking dope and you're hanging out and you're making music. Really, that's the outcome. Right? The process is the outcome. And you might go on and sell a bunch of records, or you might not. You might go on to have concerts, or you might not. But you can read many of the biographies or watch documentaries on this, and the band people, in retrospect, almost invariably say they just really liked being in the band. I think it was Ringo Starr who said having a band is the greatest luxury in the world, because they asked him, like, you don't get all this money, blah, blah, blah. And he's like, no, the greatest luxury in the world is being in a band. That's what he likes, like just being in the band, making music, playing music. That's the greatness. This is the valuable thing that you want. But notice this has a couple of elements. Again, one, you're not isolated. You're not on your own. You're not the genius doing, the work of historical greatness. You're a guy in a rock band trying to make some music that might turn out to be works of historical genius, or might just be some bad rock music, which is fine, right? This is all okay. And once you let go of that, once you surrender this notion of the tortured artist effect, then you go, hey, wait a second. Voltaire said this. Voltaire said the world does not need another poor artist, right? He's like, so he made sure that he was not poor. He was very successful at not being poor, or Voltaire. And he worked, again, often with teams, often with groups, often with lots of fun noblemen and women. So, doing plays and getting in trouble and going to prison and doing all kinds of interesting things, but he did them generally relatively publicly. And that kind of notion of just producing endless amounts and enjoying, some of it's good, some of it's not as good, and just rolling along, right? That idea is that the house of the intellect isn't a hotel that you visit once in a while and then move on. The point of the house of the intellect is to be someplace, obviously place being a conceptual place, where the process is the product, right? It's a way of life, not an outcome. It's not like, oh, I've got, and this is, getting back to the example I began with, is there are false friends, the people you would think is like, oh, I have an endowed chair at a university. Now I'm a member of the House of the Intellect. If the process of getting that chair has inculcated you a style of life that does not lend itself to being a member of the House of the Intellect, then having that endowed chair does nothing for you. And this is clearly one of the things that's happened to the university. It's so competitive. People are so focused on getting their awards for their recognition and getting advancement and all this, that by the time they get someplace that you would think would allow them to feel like they're in the House of the Intellect, that's not. They have this sort of mercenary, self-obsessed quality to them because that's what it takes to get to where they've achieved. And it's not that the achievement isn't small. It's just that it's not that kind of, communal House of the Intellect feel. And so it is really the cultivation of the way of life that we've talked about, caring about yourself, caring about history, valuing artistic output, spending time thinking, spending time reflecting and writing and pondering those things that you think are important, and then seeking out other people of shared values. This process creates its own sensibility. And that sensibility is undermined by the notion of A, that you should be isolated, and B, that you should be really focused on some product or outcome or outgrowth that will make all this sacrifice or whatever worthwhile. And so if you look at biographies and what people talk about, salons are a great example. As I mentioned earlier, like doctors used to be these paragons of the House of the Intellect because they provided all kinds of resources. But many of the doctors, I listed a bunch that we know from history, but many of the doctors were doing things that don't get you recorded in history. And so if your goal is to be recorded in history, this is very different than being a member of the House of the Intellect, which is to say, wow, I had a really enjoyable time with lots of bright people who were doing interesting things. I want to talk to them and spend some more time with them and participate some more because that was great. You see, obviously this is just, I'm belaboring the point here probably, but you see the fundamental difference. Like, where is your product? As long as we're focused on where is your product, then you're on the wrong team. Right. And it's not that it's bad to produce stuff. It's great to produce stuff. In fact, I think it's much easier to be productive and to keep going if you're in a community that makes you feel good and feel supportive and is itself producing things, because then you're like, oh, I should do some stuff. I should keep this going, right? Like, I want to participate. I want to have something interesting to say or something interesting to show, or at least to keep growing and to keep participating. And this is all fun and self-reinforcing. But if you're in an environment that says, oh, this is achieved through isolation and through the genius that can't talk to or compromise with anybody outside, well, then, it becomes self-defeating often. That is the narrative where I think this is part of the poison that we've been given and that we take in. And again, it extends to school processes and also work because we're so obsessed with getting credit for ourselves. It's always about credit for me. How do I get things that make for me, as opposed to how do I do something with my band so that we can play a gig, right? Oh, well, we got to do all these things. We got to get, we got to organize a band. That's a lot of organization. How much beer do we need, right? These kinds of valuable questions have to be answered. This doesn't make bands bad, right? Lots of music that people like come from bands, which are by definition sort of group projects. And people say, oh, we hate group projects. We hate being graded by the blah, blah, blah. So yeah, but if you get to select the group and you get to select the project, it gets a lot more enticing all of a sudden. Right. So this is part of it. The enforced group project with people you don't want to be with doing stuff that you think is stupid, that's not so fun. But if you can have a sort of cooperative project where people go, oh yeah, we can buy into that vision, we can try this out, Hey, that's a very different idea. And again, the Sistine Chapel with Michelangelo, he did not do this by himself. This was a group project. I mean, he did a lot. Oh my God, did he do a lot? So I'm not saying he's slacking by any stretch of the imagination. Again, Einstein, Dostoevsky, all these characters who were told are these, the great paragons of the isolated genius were not paragons of isolated genius. Or people like Sartre from the world of philosophy, who just lived in cafes, had an apartment, was at parties all the time, and lived like 2 blocks from his mom. So he was always hanging out with his mom. And I'm like, but he did, and he also wrote a lot of philosophy, right? He got his work done. And so this is just, it's crazy. The narrative, or Gustav Klimt, who lived, I think, with his mom and his sister, and then his studio, which was like a harem essentially, was just divided by a curtain. Like he had a doorway with a curtain over it. And so on one hand, you had like whatever the hell Klimt was doing in his studio with this harem of women that he always had around. And then you had like he's living with his mom and his sister on the other side of that curtain and through that door down the hallway. And I'm like, yeah, okay, that's another way to organize it, right? Like, what kind of milieu environment do you want to inhabit? But as long as we're told and believe that it's I, me, my, mine, and that's the only proof and the reciprocal focus of my genius, of my capacity, and that interaction with and time with and exposure to other people is going to limit and poison and damage me. And that comes all the way back, even if you look at the patterns that I talked about, which is one thing that caused me to think about this as an exit lecture. You emphasize, okay, reading. This is generally a singular activity, although you can do reading aloud, which used to be more prevalent back before people were as literate. So being able to read aloud was great because the non-literate people could participate. And then writing tended to be very solitary activity, and studying and note taking. And you go down this and you go, okay, that's a list of a lot of quiet, alone things, which is fair. It's great. But how much of that do you need to do? And is it not helpful? I think for most people it is, to then have, as part of that process, other people that you spend time with, other opportunities to open up to the world, to have experiences, to travel, to go to dinner, to have a conversation about writing or reading or novels or arts or focus or whatever it is you're interested in, doesn't matter, as a way of feeding back and reinforcing what you're doing. And the notion that you're supposed to spend 40 hours a week grinding away on whatever your art form is just absurd, right? I've said, I think in another lecture, that if you wrote a page a day, that would be a novel a year. That would be a crazy pace. Not that some writers haven't maintained that, a few have, but generally speaking, that, even good dedicated novelists, if they can get a novel out every 2 or 3 years, that's pretty damn impressive, which means you've got to write, a third of a page a day, a half a page every other day, something like this, to keep the. You should have some time to do other stuff, and you should allow yourself to have time to do other stuff, because it turns out that other stuff is really vitally important to keeping you inspired and focused and making you feel like what you're doing matters, and so on and so forth. It turns out that it's much less important that a publisher publish your book and you get on a New York Times bestseller list or worst seller list than it is that you every day or every week or every month have continual exposure to people who make you feel like what you're doing and who you are is important and valuable. Because if you feel like what you're doing and who you are is important and valuable, then you just don't care what the New York Times says. Right? Lots of really good books have not been on the New York Times bestseller list, and lots of really, really bad books have been on the New York Times bestseller list, right? It's a very bad metric, right? This is a bad way to judge things. And that kind of, and yet these are the kinds of metrics that our society tells us, like, oh, this is what you should embrace. This is what you should be shooting for. This is what you should be grinding away at, as opposed to existing in a society and with people who go, oh no, we think you're an interesting person. It sounds like you're doing interesting work. Like, you keep going. Like, we're either directly or indirectly. Like, oh, we're just all doing crazy stuff. And so if you're in a group of people who are doing crazy stuff and you're doing crazy stuff, then you feel like this is natural and normal and, good on you. But if you don't get that reinforcement, if you don't ever have that sensibility or be immersed in that sensibility, then of course you look at something like, a publishing contract or an award or a bestseller list or a commission or whatever it is, and all of a sudden you go, oh my gosh, like that would make everything good. Then everything would be justified. Then I would know that I mattered. Then I would count. And it turns out that no, it won't work, and that doesn't help. I mean, maybe it doesn't hurt, but it doesn't help because the house of the intellect, again, is a pattern of life. It's no particular outcome. It's no award or position or amount of money or any of that. That doesn't help. In fact, it can actively destroy what's going on. And so when you establish the pattern of life, it's actually quite powerful because it insulates you in a way from these sort of false narratives, these false goals that are hugely misleading. And again, don't improve the quality of your life. These goals, these ideas, these titles, these positions are not there with the goal of like, hey, let's make this lady's life better. They're serving their own functions. There's a mathematician who, I believe he won the Fields Medal. And he said, life is so constituted that should you ever be fortunate enough to make a significant contribution, it will make sure that you don't have the time to ever do that again. And I was talking to a writer who had the same problem. All of a sudden the pressure comes like, oh, here's 1,000 other things for you to do. Now you've got the imprimatur of achievement. Let's have you do everything else but whatever it was that you did to get to this position that you had. And if you liked your life and all of a sudden people are like, oh, we want you to travel here and give a lecture there, or, teach here and take time off and do that. It's like, no, I want to keep doing what I was doing. And Barzan writes about this in the House of the Intellect, that if you want a grant to do some kind of work, they're going to want you to do everything, like do filling out the grant, do grant reporting, go to a conference on the grant, publish a paper on the grant, all the subject, none of which is probably what the grant is for, right? He said, so if you actually look at the way grants are written, the way they're handed out and what you have to do, they actually impede often the very things that they're supposed to be funding. Like he said, if you want people to do the work they're doing, just send them money for what they're doing. Don't make them fill out paperwork. Why? Like, oh, we think you're a good composer of operas. We're just going to send you some money and say, keep composing operas. No, this is absolutely not what they do. This is not how it gets done. Number one, it would unemploy immediately. It would eliminate the jobs of lots of people who administer these awards program. And people who administer things think other people need to do a lot of administrating too. They love paperwork. You should love paperwork. They like accounting. You should love accounting. Like whatever it is, but it's not writing an opera or, fill in the blank. Not being with your rock and roll band. And this sort of pattern is so endemic that I think it's one of if perhaps even relative to all the other pressures we feel, this very powerful narrative, because again, it's the false friend. Like, oh, this is how artists are supposed to be. This is how they're supposed to live. This is what how they're supposed to think about the world. That sensibility is, again, not just it's misleading and wrong, but it's actually actively poisonous. And if you can think in your own mind about your own productivity and your own insights and what helps you, make a list. Like, don't believe me again. Like, make a list for yourself and say, like, hey, what are the things that make me feel rewarded and make me feel healthy and make me feel uplifted and help me produce the kinds of things that I want to do, whatever it is, in the many varieties that are possible. And then go, okay, is this, I want to be an isolated genius working on my own? Or is it, I would rather be in a rock and roll band, right? Like, what sounds like more fun? What sounds more productive? What sounds like, that my days are going to be filled with more joy and more interest and more inspiration? And that is finally the goal of all of this. Like, what are we trying to achieve with the House of the Intellect? And it is functionally this pattern of behavior and thought that allows people to be creative and to expand their minds and to communicate new ideas and to understand history and the human condition in ways that could be shared and it can enrich both individual lives and communal lives. And incidentally, but periodically out of these kinds of environment grows these great, titanically amazing works that do enrich all of the world and continue to do that. But that is not a product of an isolated genius working on their own somewhere, generally. I mean, there are exceptions. I'm not saying it never happens. Again, human life on bell curve. But primarily and overwhelmingly, this is Mozart working with crowds and groups and parties and friends and operas that produces. It's Einstein with his meetings and friends and cafes and late nights and reading journals and writing letters. It's Dostoevsky, just an endless series of editorial meetings and discussions and philosophy and arguments. It's, these sorts of examples are much more relevant and consistent with what has actually worked in the past. And so if you can embrace that, and if you can go, hey, what are those things that give me joy and make me happy and make me feel good and help expand my mind and help me embrace these kinds of ideas of philosophy or literature or whatever, again, is your particular area of interest. And really ask yourself, make the list and go, does this ask me to be an isolated person on an island in the desert? Or would I just be better served to spend some time at my desk or in my studio, but also to spend a lot of time with some other people hanging around? Often, I think, perhaps not invariably, but often it is the latter. And this is what allows the communal aspect of the house of the intellect to exist. And it's only when we can destroy that narrative, or at least weaken it, and free our minds from it, that we can participate in it and we can start growing and building those houses for ourselves wherever we are. So, conclusion to the house of the intellect. I hope this was helpful because I do think it is a real necessity for us to help have that sense of community and growth. And I do think there's a lot of factors that mitigate against the existence of it in our society. And yet I am hopeful. I do think this can be done, and I think we can do it together. So, House of the Intellect conclusion, thank you very much.